So I've been a published writer for over 50 years. My first piece, of course, came out in kindergarten. The reason I call attention to that is when you've been doing this crazy work for this long, you learn some lessons that they never teach you in journalism school or a creative writing program. And one of them that came home to me powerfully in my most recent book, The Modoc War, was that the book you start out to write is not necessarily the book you end up writing. It changes itself in the process. I first bumped into the story of the Modoc War actually about 40 years ago, when I just simply stumbled into the Lava Beds National Monument, which is an absolutely severe, fierce, and strangely beautiful landscape in northeastern California, right along the Oregon border, about 30 miles south of Klamath Falls, Oregon. And when I found out that this landscape had been the setting for the Modoc War, I thought, this is a story I gotta tell. And of course, it had to be a novel, because that just was, that was my ambition. And I thought the novel turned on the Modoc leader, Kint Poos, who's also known as Captain Jack. He is the figure who is on the front of your order of service. It's a photograph taken in 1864. And as I saw it, this novel was a very Shakespearean plot. It was very much like Macbeth. It was a matter of warrior hubris so run amok that it dragged the entire Modoc people down and destroyed them. Well, I wrote that novel, and it flopped. And one of the things when you're a writer, when something flops, is you realize the material is trying to send you a message. And the message was, that's the wrong form. What I needed to do was to tell it as narrative nonfiction. The rules of narrative nonfiction are simply two. One, it's got to be a story. Number two, it has to be absolutely factual. If you want to say the sun was up at noon on May the 23rd, 1872, you better make sure it was. So you have to go in and deeply go into the facts of the story, dig down deep into it. And as I began doing that, this whole story changed. It had nothing to do with Macbeth or with the warrior hubris of Kint Poos. The fact of the matter was that no matter what Kint Poos and the Modoc people did, they were fated to be dispossessed and destroyed. Because behind this war lay the terrible reality that in the middle of the 19th century, California's policy, state-adopted, state-funded policy towards its native peoples was genocide. It's that pure and simple. Now, let me be clear, this is not my discovery. I based it on recent scholarship by two scholars in particular, Brendan Lindsay at Cal State Sacramento and Benjamin Madley at UCLA. And they built upon about 20 to 30 years of prior scholarship, because as you know, scholars don't move real fast. And they had to be very guarded. They wanted to get tenure about how they roll this stuff out, all right? Yet, even as I read their books and really began plowing into the backstory, because the essence of good narrative fiction is a lot of backstory, I found myself resisting this reality. I mean, I didn't really want to admit nor base a book on the notion that California was the site of a genocide. And I mean, like most Euro-Americans of my generation, I am obviously a firmly Catholic and still Irish. Yeah, which is good. I was raised, like I bet a lot of people here, on John Wayne movies, Manifest Destiny, and the mythic notion that America won the West through civilization, superior civilization and technology. And the truth that I had to admit as I dug into this book, I thought it would take 2 years, it took me 5, and I don't have time for writer's block. It took that long to really build the whole story. It was a lot darker than I had ever been led to believe. And I had to start overturning my own assumptions about what the history of Western America really looked like. In fact, I mean, we think of Indian wars, sort of a paradigm, a commercial paradigm within the publishing business is that Indian wars happened on the plains between 1860 and 1890. And you think about people like the Comanches, the Kiowas, the Poncas, the Lakotas, so forth. Yet, the truth of the matter is that in the middle of the 19th century, California offered the most egregious example of a genocide anywhere on American soil. When California became American, a United States possession, in 1846, it had the largest native population of any American state or territory, period. There were about 150,000 native people living in the boundaries of this state, first a territory and then later a state. And those people had suffered terribly under the Spanish-Mexican mission system. But even within that, the difference was that the Spanish-Mexican mission system, which existed until 1821 and then was secularized, actually gave natives a role. They were at the bottom. They were the grunt labor force of the economy, but they still had a role. When the early Americans took over California, they saw no role for indigenous people, period. It was that they saw them as simply getting in the way. And there was a kind of a political reality to this that made it easier to begin thinking in big terms. The Indians of California comprised 100 distinct language groups. I mean, these are languages that are as disparate as Mongolian and Quechua and German. I mean, they were not related. So there was this huge number of different languages. And most of the people were organized into small local tribes. And unlike those paradigmatic plains wars with the Lakotas, the Cheyennes, and the Comanches, who were very large Indian nations who were organized around warfare, California's Indians pretty much got along. They did not do much intertribal warfare. It was very unusual. And usually it was a matter of taking revenge on somebody who had stolen something or violated a territory. And so as a result, they had little experience with fighting back and no particular cultural capacity to think in those terms. Whereas, think about it, the settlers coming in were very much organized that way. What added to this genocide, though, is that it wasn't just raw political power. There are religious roots. And it's really important for us as a community of faith to recognize this. The whole conquest of the North America, and particularly in the West, is really rooted in something called the doctrine of discovery, which goes back into 15th century Roman Catholic canon law, which made it perfectly okay for Christians to kill and or enslave pagans, non-believers. In that day, originally it really meant Muslims, but and take over their land. Now, that was then extended to the indigenous people in the Americas as the Americas were opened up by European explorers. Now, even though this was Roman Catholic originally and it was religious, the principle became also one of secular law, and it began to inform what we know as manifest destiny, which was first articulated, I think, 1846 by an Irishman. Not one of our better moments, where he said basically it was the will of divine providence that America extend from sea to shining sea. So when we pushed out Indians and took over their land and killed them off, that was divine work. Let that sink in for a minute. This is religion in the service of murder. And it was normal. That's the way the world worked. The state of California, which was very new, turned this sort of religious justification and the political reality into laws that created what amounted to chattel slavery of natives, particularly for children. Even like in LA, you could buy or sell kids, Indian kids. And also, it was illegal for native people to testify against whites in court. As a result, you could get away with just about anything, unless a white man were willing to testify against your actions. And guess what? That didn't happen very often. But the state was actually priming itself for making another move. If you look at genocides, they go in a stepwise fashion. They don't suddenly happen. There's a series of steps leading up to, call it the final solution. And this began being articulated in California in 1851, first by Peter Burnett. He was the original civilian governor of this state. And his first ever State of the State address, he devoted much of the address to the problem posed by indigenous people to the state's progress. And he basically said the state's policy towards tribal nations needed to be what we now call genocide. In the vocabulary of the time, they called it extermination. Let me quote this. This is from Burnett. This is from that speech. "The two races must remain ever at enmity. A war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. The inevitable destiny of the indigenous race is beyond the wisdom or power of the white man to avert." Hear that? He's saying we're going to wipe them out, and that's just social evolution. But to make sure that that social evolution actually happened, the California legislature passed funding bills of $1.7 million, a little less than $40 million now, to exterminate Indians. And what that mostly went for was to pay for local militias that would find something of a pretext. Typically, it was cattle or horses or mules being stolen, rustled, often for food because many indigenous people were starving. They would locate and attack the village of the purported rustlers. Often it was any Indians they bumped into. They would gather up what few survivors there were, and they would force march them to a reservation where people lived on like 400 calories a day, and public health conditions were horrific. The reservations, in fact, were as much a killing field as the militia campaigns. And it's also important to understand that there was nothing secretive about this policy. It was widely known. It was not a secret. And yet, the curious thing is, if you dig around in the newspapers and other accounts of the time, the general public largely kept its mouth shut, which is very typical in a genocide situation. You may remember the writer Bret Hart. Yeah, right, okay. A lot of people took American Lit. I see these heads white. He kind of set the stage for Mark Twain. When he was 24 years old, he was a reporter up in Arcata, California. And there was a whole series of massacres of Indians, absolutely peaceful Indians, on the last weekend of February in 1860. And he had outraged Hart. I mean, he just was in a fury. And so, like writers do, he wrote about it. And he wrote a blistering editorial in this little weekly newspaper condemning the killings. And very soon thereafter, Bret Hart had to flee town because there was a lynch mob looking for him. I mean, that's what happened. So and he never again wrote about Indians like that. I mean, he was scarred. There was a wound that was done to him. And there was absolutely a message being sent that if you protest against this, we'll mark you. Now, the Modocs, way up in northeastern California, were one of the very few tribal nations in this state to fight back. And that resistance grew into the only true Indian war waged in California. If you follow their fate, you can see kind of what happened to all the native people in this state. In 1846, when California became an American possession, the Modocs numbered as many as 2,000 people. First, there was an epidemic of measles that was carried in by immigrant trains going through their territory. The immigrant route used Modoc trails, and they were like public health disasters. So measles popped up in the people and killed quite a few. And then, as this money became available for militia campaigns, there were several of those launched against the Modocs, who had a reputation for being rather, and they were kind of warlike. They had been slave traders for a time, and they were a pretty tough bunch. So they would go into their territory, kill as many Indians as possible. By 1864, when the Modocs and 2 other tribes agreed to go onto the same reservation, there were only a little bit more than 300 Modocs left. So they had been killed down from somewhere around 2,000 to 300. Now, the problem with the reservation was it wasn't really an escape. There was no funding for it. And Indians began starving. They were killing their horses for food. And so about half, and the Modocs were a very horse-oriented people. They were really a Great Basin tribe in that way. And for them to kill their horses for food that was absolute desperation. So about half of the tribe picked up and left the reservation. They moved back onto Lost River just across the border in Oregon. And they took part in the Modoc War of 1872 to 1873. At the end of that war, they lost. As was typical, it was at one point there were about 55 men with guns, and they were up against 1,000 soldiers. Curiously, there were far more whites than Indians killed. They were much better at that particular business than the typical enlistee in the Army was. But there were 153 Modoc survivors, and they were all sent to Oklahoma. They were exiled. They were not allowed to return to their home base in California and Oregon. And the curious thing is, over the next 20 years, even though there were children being born to some of the survivors, in that 20-year period, that 153 people became 90. You can see, once again, the whole pattern of this sort of decline continued right on the reservation. That same pattern held true across this state. When the California, remember I said the California native population in 1846 was 150,000. It was down to 30,000 in 1873 when the Modoc War ended, and historical convention now is that's the end of the California genocide. Yet the curious thing is that the population continued to fall. It was down to 15,000 by 1900. So all that were left, or the number of indigenous people in the state of California in 1900, was 10% of what it had been just a little over 50 years before. Now, one thing I find, though, about when I read these numbers and I write about them is that they just become numbing. You know, it's hard to see the full dimension of this. And I don't think I really got it until in the past few months. I did a number of readings with Greg Saras. Greg is a novelist, a very good novelist, and he's also a college professor, and he's the chairman of the Federated Tribes of the Grayton Rancheria. Yes, that casino, which is based in Roanoke Park. These days, there are about 1,500 people who are enrolled citizens of the Federated Tribes. All of them, Greg told me, are the descendants of just 14 Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo women, the only individuals from those nations to survive the genocide. Before the contact, there were 20,000 Coast Miwoks and Southern Pomos. So of those, only 14 people survived to pass on their genes and family lines. It's hard for us sitting here in air conditioning on a Sunday morning in California to get our heads around that level of destruction, the way those lives were pulled apart. There's a real lesson for all of us in this story that's kind of a general political lesson, and it is that, which I think is one particularly important in our current climate, where white supremacy and racist hatred have become mainstream currencies. I should not go that way. All right. I was thinking about Trump's rally most recently. We like to believe, we have, the whole notion of American exceptionalism is a notion that our democratic constitutional institutions, of which we are justifiably proud, protect us against mass atrocities on the order of genocide. In fact, we like to think of genocide as something that happens far, far away. Somewhere like Nazi Germany or Cambodia under Pol Pot or Rwanda, right? Yet the truth is that our home state orchestrated a genocide. There's no escaping that conclusion. American institutions and laws were and are no guarantee against that kind of atrocity. It has happened here. It can happen again. And it's also important to understand that California's genocide and all the other acts of destruction and dispossession of Native Americans that extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Canadian border to the Mexican, are not simply historical events. They didn't just stop. William Faulkner famously wrote, "The past is never dead, it isn't even past." And when you look at some of the statistics around kind of public health, social statistics in this country, you see a really series of awful horrors. For example, almost half of Native women who live on or near a reservation are targeted by sexual violence at some point in their lives, and almost all that violence is committed by non-tribal people. In many cases, tribal courts can't prosecute perpetrators because they're not tribal. So the result is that by and large, white guys get away with it. That sounds like the Indian Wars to me. About as many as 300 Native women are either killed or go missing every year in the United States and Canada. The exact number isn't clear because neither nation keeps precise statistics. That very lack of accounting speaks volumes. As for Native men, they are more likely than any other ethnic group to be killed in a police encounter. They are the most likely to be killed in a confrontation or just being pulled over. That's what happens. And I'll bet most of you didn't know that until just now, right? I didn't until I started researching it, right? And you also may not know something that's to the good side, which is that California's Native people have demonstrated remarkable resilience and persistence. The current Native American population of this state is the largest of any state. It is due both to the recovery of California's original tribal nations and also the migration into this state of Native people from other parts of the country. So there's an upswing going on. The reason, though, we don't know about the upswing or the continued crises that face Indian country is the cultural erasure of indigenous people. They just aren't there. In the national conversation, they don't exist. They're overlooked. And if there is to be justice, if there is to be a remedy to the results of this genocide and all the other acts of violence perpetrated against indigenous folks for being indigenous, we have to end that cultural erasure. I mean, that has to end. Thank you. Okay. Which leads me to a question, which I'm trying to answer, which is, what can we do, both Native and non-Native people alike? I mean, it's a responsibility for all of us. We're all Americans. We have to think about this. And I think, honestly, that religion is something that is very, very important here. Remember that the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny are rooted in the religious heritage of the United States. But you also know that there are Christians of conscience who say, what would Jesus do? That's a really good question. What would Jesus do when you're facing something tough? And there actually is a question that we UUs have not begun asking, but I think we ought to. And at least part of the answer hangs in that banner off of the back of our sanctuary, which says, just love. Love, it tells us, all by itself can be enough. Love offers a path to justice. So the UU question of conscience becomes, what can just love do? What can we make happen? What can we do coming out of the deepest current in our faith do about this kind of thing? And this isn't Pollyanna pie in the sky. I'm not talking about something sweet and sentimental. I mean, love is hard. It's really hard. And you can see it in a recent example of how it worked at Standing Rock, North Dakota. Now, if you don't remember that one, it was a protest that began in August 2016, and it ran on into February 2017. And it was led, and let me say led, by the Standing Rock Sioux Nation and directed against the threat that the Dakota Access Pipeline poses to the upper Missouri River and 18 million Americans downstream who use it for their water source. They were being serious water protectors. That's exactly what Denise was talking about in her Time for All Ages. The fascinating thing about Standing Rock was that it wasn't just one tribal nation. 360 tribal nations came together in support of that protest. There had never been a show of solidarity across Indian country like that. That's the biggest ever. They were joined by indigenous activists from Guatemala, Brazil, Tibet, and Scandinavia. And there were a lot of faith leaders, American faith leaders, and environmental organizations. There was a very strong showing of Unitarian Universalists. Huge. And in fact, the UUs, along with 7 other denominations, burned a Latin version of the Doctrine of Discovery in an abalone shell. Yes, burned it in an abalone shell as a ritual destruction of the Doctrine of Discovery. And one UU leader said, it was ours to do and it's ours to destroy. Think about that. They took this history and they eliminated it. The important thing, though, here is not just UUs showing up. It was Standing Rock put Native leaders front and center on television screens and social media day after day after day. They were the leaders. Cultural erasure was overturned through the leadership of people like Dave Archambault, Chase Iron Eyes, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, and Floris White Bull. And there was a tone to this protest, a tone set by the Dakota set by the Indian leaders, that this was a protest, quote from Floris White Bull, in prayer, not violence, to face the fear with love. Wasn't about opposing force, it was about using love to stop destruction. That love, that sense of just love, motivated the involvement of the Bismarck Mandan UU congregation in Bismarck, North Dakota, which is located about 45 miles north of the protest site, and it still to this day serves as a center for non-native support of the indigenous water protectors. It was led by Karen Van Fossen, Reverend Karen Van Fossen, who's the pastor of that congregation. She led that work, and she continued on into 2018 General Assembly, which passed a action of immediate witness proclaiming UU solidarity with indigenous water protectors. It's not over. And I talked to Reverend Van Fossen. I really wanted to find out more about what drew her into supporting this. And she pointed out that the Dakota Access Pipeline is a contemporary manifestation of colonialism. It's still going on. Remember, the past is never past. The past is never dead, It isn't even past. The colonialism in our past continues. It's a system that consumes land, water, and people to serve greed. Colonialism harms everybody, native and non-native, and it creates a profound anti-human spiritual crisis that it is our job to begin to overcome. Guilt over our history, whether it be for the treatment of the Standing Rock Sioux, the fate of the Modocs, or the California genocide, isn't the answer. We do have to write true histories. We have to tell the story as it really was. We have to do that instead of engaging in self-justifying whitewash. And as we learn better the truth of these stories, we need to decolonize our own souls. Colonialism is internal as well as external. And we have to do by working from what Reverend Van Fossen, and I'm quoting, calls a place of humility and maintaining a practice of listening to Native nations. This is where just love draws its power, particularly for us Euro-Americans. It opens us to humility, a word whose Latin root means on the ground of the earth. On the ground of the earth. That's what humility is about. It lets us listen from way deep down with our feet planted solidly on the earth and not make noise, to actually listen. And it comes from extending a radical welcome to all peoples and all beings as our relations. When we all become family, when everyone is our relative, the light of community, the light of love, pushes aside the darkness and the division. In closing, I want you to hear again the closing lines of Joy Harjo's "Once the World Was Perfect," because it absolutely gets this at the poetic level. These are those closing lines. We were bumping into each other in the dark, and now we had no place to live since we didn't know how to live with each other. Then one of the stumbling ones took pity on another and shared a blanket. A spark of kindness made a light. The light made an opening in the darkness. Everyone worked together to make a ladder. A Wind Clan person climbed out first into the next world, and then the other clans, the children of those clans, their children, and their children, all the way through time to now, into this morning light to you.